The most powerful empire the ancient world had ever seen could not stop it. Not with soldiers, not with sealed tombs, not with the full weight of Roman law pressed down on a single man in an occupied province at the edge of the known world. That is where this story begins. Not in the abstract, not in the language of theology, but in the dust and stone of first-century Judea, where a carpenter from an unremarkable northern town collided with the machinery of the greatest military and administrative power in human history. And the machinery lost. But to understand how that happened, to feel the weight of what it meant, you have to understand what Rome actually was. Not Rome as a symbol, Rome as a physical, breathing, intimidating reality that ordinary people encountered every single morning of their lives. What did it actually feel like to live under Roman occupation? What did the soldiers look like when they walked through your market? What happened to men who defied the empire's authority? And why, despite everything Rome could deploy, did something happen in Jerusalem around 30 CE that no amount of imperial force could contain or reverse? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels and how we understand what it cost to believe in what was written long before any of it came to pass. If you find this kind of deep historical exploration meaningful, consider subscribing to this channel, because this is exactly the work we do here, every time. Rome did not govern its provinces quietly. It governed them visibly, deliberately, and with a precision designed to make resistance feel not just dangerous, but absurd. In Jerusalem, that presence was architectural before it was military. The Antonia Fortress, a massive stone complex built by Herod the Great and named in honor of Mark Antony, sat at the northwestern corner of the Temple Mount itself. This was not accidental placement. Roman engineers and Herodian planners understood that the temple was the beating heart of Jewish public life, not merely religious in the modern sense of the word, but civic, economic, legal, and deeply psychological. To place a Roman military garrison overlooking the temple courts was to say, in stone, that the God of Israel operated within the tolerance of Caesar. The fortress had towers. From those towers, Roman soldiers could look directly down into the temple courtyards during the great festivals, Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, when tens of thousands of pilgrims flooded Jerusalem from across the Roman world and beyond. The soldiers were watching. Everyone knew they were watching. That awareness shaped behavior, constrained language, filtered the kinds of conversations men would risk in open spaces. The streets of Jerusalem in this period were not the wide, romantic passages of later imagination. In the lower city, they were narrow, often unpaved, hemmed in by stone walls that absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly into the night air. The smell was a layered thing. Baking bread from the merchant quarters in the early morning, animal waste from the livestock markets near the gates, the particular dry dust scent of limestone that defines this part of the world even now. People moved through these streets with specific purposes. Idling was a luxury of the wealthy. For most residents, each hour carried obligations. The Roman soldiers who moved through these streets were unmistakable. Their equipment, iron helmets, lorica segmentata armor, the short gladius sword, the heavy scutum shield, was standardized in ways that broadcast identity across languages and cultures. You did not need to speak Latin to recognize a Roman legionary. The sound of hobnailed sandals on stone pavement, calligi, was its own language. A rhythm that meant, make space, lower your eyes, continue your business without drawing attention. This is important to hold in mind. Ordinary Jewish residents of Jerusalem were not living in a state of constant armed revolt. Most were navigating a careful daily negotiation between their identity, their Torah, their temple, their calendar, their food laws, their language, and the omnipresent reality of Roman authority. Resistance existed, absolutely. But for most families, most days, survival meant precision, saying the right things to the right people, paying the taxes that were demanded, keeping your children close during festival crowds, when tensions historically ran high and soldiers historically ran nervous. Into this world, this specific, material, pressurized world, came a man who spoke with an authority that the Roman system had no category for. Not political authority, not priestly authority, not the authority of wealth or bloodline. Something else, something that people who heard him described with a single repeated observation. He taught as one who had authority, and not as their scribes. That phrase deserves to be unpacked carefully, because it carries more historical weight than it first appears to hold. The scribes of first-century Judea were not simply copyists in the modern sense. They were legal scholars, interpreters of Torah, the intellectual class who mediated between ancient text and present reality. Their authority was derivative. It flowed from the chain of tradition, from citation of earlier masters, from alignment with recognized schools of interpretation. To speak as a scribe was to speak inside a system of inherited legitimacy. Jesus did not do that. He said, "You have heard that it was said, but I say to you." That formulation, repeated and deliberate, was not a rhetorical device chosen for impact. It was a direct claim to something the Roman system could not process, and the religious establishment could not comfortably absorb. He was not citing tradition. He was not deferring to the chain of masters. He was speaking from a source of authority that existed, apparently, entirely within himself. And the crowds noticed, and the authorities noticed. And Rome, at the edge of its awareness of provincial religious dynamics, would eventually notice too. The collision was not sudden. It had been building through years of public ministry, through healings and confrontations and teachings that drew crowds and generated controversy in precisely the places: Galilee, Jerusalem, the temple courts, where large gatherings of excited Jewish men were exactly what Roman garrison commanders had been trained to consider threats. This is where the prophecy enters the picture, not as background decoration, but as a structural force that shaped how the events were understood by those living through them, and how they have been understood by hundreds of millions of people in the 2,000 years since. The Hebrew prophetic tradition was not, in the first century, a dusty archive of ancient literature that scholars consulted in quiet rooms. It was alive. It was debated in synagogues from Galilee to Alexandria. It was memorized by children before they could read fluently. It was the framework through which ordinary Jewish families made sense of their present suffering and oriented their hope toward a future that God had, they believed, already committed himself to bring about. To understand what Rome was dealing with in Judea, and why the execution of one man failed so catastrophically to achieve what executions were designed to achieve, you have to understand what these people were carrying inside them before Jesus ever appeared in public. The scroll of Isaiah had been copied and recopied for centuries. In the caves near Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were eventually discovered, archaeologists found a complete copy of Isaiah that predates the events of the Gospels by more than a century. This was not a text preserved by institutions alone. It was preserved by communities for whom it was living speech. And Isaiah had said things that did not fit comfortably inside any political settlement Rome could offer. He had described a servant, a figure who would be despised and rejected, a man of suffering acquainted with grief, one from whom people would hide their faces. He had written that this servant would be wounded for transgressions, crushed for iniquities, and that the punishment that brought peace would fall upon him. He had described a death among the wicked and a grave with the rich. And then, without explanation in the logic of normal human events, had continued to speak of this figure's future. He would see the light of life. The will of God would prosper in his hand. Handel would later set portions of this to music so overwhelming that audiences stood instinctively. But that response was not invented in the 18th century. The instinct it touched was already present in first-century Jewish communities who read these words and felt in them the shape of something enormous preparing to happen. The prophet Micah had specified, with a precision that troubled later readers for its specificity, that the one who would come would emerge from Bethlehem Ephrathah, a village so small it was among the least of the clans of Judah. The prophet Daniel had written of a timeline, 70 weeks of years, that scholars and communities had been calculating and debating for generations, trying to determine when the culminating event of history would arrive. The prophet Zechariah had described a king entering Jerusalem not on a war horse, but on a donkey. Humble, but unmistakably royal, welcomed by crowds spreading garments in his path. The Psalms, specifically Psalm 22, contained a description of suffering so precisely physical that it included details about hands and feet, about bones out of joint, about a circle of enemies dividing garments by casting lots, that would later be recognized as a map drawn before the territory existed. These texts were not hidden. They were public. They were debated. Different communities read them differently. Some expected a military liberator. Some expected a priestly figure. Some expected a heavenly being. Some expected something no existing category could fully hold. The diversity of first-century Jewish messianic expectation was genuine and wide. But the texts themselves were fixed, and what happened in Jerusalem over the course of a Passover week around 30 CE aligned with those fixed texts in ways that were either the most extraordinary coincidence in the history of religion or something else entirely. Rome had no framework for this problem. Roman religion was fundamentally transactional. The gods, numerous, specialized, often capricious, were managed through ritual, sacrifice, and proper observance. The Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods, was maintained by correct procedure. If catastrophe came, it meant something had been done incorrectly and needed to be remedied through prescribed action. The idea of a single God who had spoken specific words through specific human beings across many centuries, all converging on a single moment in a single city. This was not a category that Roman administrative or religious thinking had developed tools to address. What Roman thinking had tools to address was public disorder. Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea at the time of Jesus' execution, was not a villain of unusual cruelty by the standards of his office. He was a Roman administrator managing a province that was exceptionally difficult, religiously volatile, politically complex, populated by people whose loyalty was to a covenant with their God that preceded and superseded any obligation to Caesar. Ancient sources, including the Jewish writer Josephus and the philosopher Philo of Alexandria, both describe Pilate as a man whose methods often escalated tensions rather than resolved them. He had previously brought military standards bearing the image of Caesar into Jerusalem, a deliberate or careless provocation that resulted in mass protest. He had raided temple treasury funds to build an aqueduct, which sparked demonstrations he suppressed with soldiers disguised among the crowds. He was not, in other words, a careful diplomat. He was a Roman prefect doing the job Rome had given him, which was fundamentally to maintain order and extract tax revenue in that priority. When Jesus was brought before him during Passover, the most politically charged week of the Jewish calendar, when the city's population swelled to perhaps 10 times its ordinary size, with pilgrims who had traveled from across the Mediterranean world, Pilate faced a calculation that was entirely pragmatic. The chief priests had delivered this man to him. The charge, as they framed it for Roman ears, was that he claimed to be king of the Jews, a political charge, because religious charges were not Pilate's jurisdiction, and both parties understood this. A man claiming royal authority in an occupied province was, by Roman law, a threat to the order Pilate was paid to maintain. Pilate's own account, preserved in the Gospel narratives, suggests he found the charge unpersuasive. He examined Jesus. He found no basis for a capital sentence. He attempted to release him through the Passover custom of prisoner release. He offered the crowd a choice. What followed? The crowd choosing Barabbas, an actual insurrectionist, over the man Rome's own prefect found innocent, was either a profound historical irony or a moment thick with the strange logic of events moving toward a conclusion that had been written before any of the participants were born. Pilate ordered the crucifixion. The machinery of Roman execution moved forward with its customary efficiency. And at this point, Rome believed the matter was finished. Crucifixion was not simply a method of execution, it was a message. A carefully engineered, publicly displayed, socially calibrated message, and Rome had refined the delivery of that message over centuries of practice. The cross was chosen not because it was the most efficient way to kill a person. There were faster methods available to Roman executioners. The cross was chosen because it was the most effective way to communicate to everyone who witnessed it, and to everyone who would hear about it afterward, that the person dying on it had been stripped of every claim to dignity, authority, and significance that they had ever held or ever would hold. Roman legal scholars of the period used a specific phrase to describe crucifixion: summum supplicium, the supreme punishment. But supreme in this context did not mean reserved for the worst crimes in a moral sense. It meant reserved for the most complete form of public humiliation. Crucifixion was prescribed for slaves who had defied their masters, for rebels against Roman authority, for those who needed to be not merely killed, but unmade, erased as social and symbolic forces by the manner of their dying. The process began before the cross itself. Scourging, the preliminary beating administered with a flagellum, a whip with multiple leather strands tipped with pieces of bone or metal, was itself capable of killing a person before crucifixion began. It shredded skin and subcutaneous tissue across the back, shoulders, and legs. Its purpose was partly punitive, but also partly practical. A man who had been severely scourged was weakened enough to be managed more easily during the crucifixion process itself. The condemned was then required to carry the horizontal beam of the cross, the patibulum, through the public streets to the place of execution. This was theater as much as logistics. The route was public. The crowds that gathered were not incidental. They were part of the design. To walk that route was to be seen, recognized, degraded before the community in which you had lived and taught, and claimed whatever authority you had claimed. Outside Jerusalem's walls, on an elevation visible from the roads that entered the city, the vertical post was already fixed in the ground. The condemned was stripped, another deliberate removal of social identity, since clothing in the ancient world was not merely covering, but a marker of status, occupation, and honor, and nailed to the assembled cross through the wrists and feet. Death came slowly. It came through a combination of blood loss, exposure, shock, and ultimately suffocation, as the condemned lost the muscular strength to push upward against the nails in order to exhale. Hours could pass. In some documented cases, days. The soldiers assigned to crucifixion details remained at the site. Their presence served two purposes: to prevent anyone from attempting a rescue, and to ensure that the body remained on the cross long enough for the message to be fully received. Roman law generally did not permit the burial of the crucified. The body was left on the cross or thrown into a common pit. One final denial of dignity, since proper burial was, across virtually every culture in the ancient Near East, a fundamental obligation owed to the dead by the living. To be denied burial was to be denied a place in the community of the dead. It was the last erasure. Now hold all of that in your mind, the totality of what Rome's system of crucifixion was designed to accomplish, and consider what the followers of Jesus reported in the days immediately following his death. They did not report a movement that had been successfully suppressed. They reported an empty tomb. This detail, whatever one makes of it theologically, has significant historical texture that is sometimes lost in abstract theological debate. The tomb was not simply discovered empty by people predisposed to find it that way. The Gospel accounts describe a Roman guard posted at the tomb specifically to prevent the body from being removed, because the authorities were aware that Jesus had spoken about rising on the third day, and they wanted no possibility of a staged deception. The stone sealing the entrance was large enough to require multiple men to move. The location was known. And yet something happened that Sunday morning that launched within weeks a movement of public proclamation in Jerusalem itself, the city where the crucifixion had occurred, where the tomb was located, where anyone could have walked to it and investigated, that Jesus of Nazareth had risen from the dead. Consider the strategic absurdity of this claim if it were fabricated. If the disciples had stolen the body, as the authorities immediately claimed, the last thing they would have done is begin preaching the resurrection publicly in Jerusalem, where investigation was immediately possible, and where the cost of being caught in a deception was lethal. The same Roman system that had crucified Jesus was still fully operational. The same chief priests who had delivered him to Pilate were still in their positions. The environment for a successful public fraud of this magnitude was essentially zero. And yet the proclamation did not begin in Galilee, at a safe distance. It began in Jerusalem. On Pentecost, 50 days after Passover, when the city was again full of pilgrims, Peter stood in a public space and declared that the man Rome had crucified had been raised by God, and that this resurrection was the fulfillment of what David had written in the Psalms centuries before. The audience he was addressing was not composed of credulous outsiders. They were Jewish pilgrims who knew their scriptures, who knew what crucifixion meant, who knew what the official Roman and priestly account of the matter was. Many of them had been in Jerusalem during Passover. Some of them may have been in the crowds that week, and according to the account preserved in the book of Acts, 3,000 of them were persuaded that day. Rome's supreme punishment had produced, within 50 days, a community of thousands in the very city where it had been carried out. The mechanism by which crucifixion was supposed to work, the permanent discrediting of the crucified person's claims and identity, had failed. Not partially, completely. And the reason it had failed, according to those who were there, was not organizational. It was not political. It was not the result of clever messaging or strategic timing. It was because the tomb was empty. There is a question that serious historians, including those who do not hold Christian faith, have found genuinely difficult to dismiss. Not the question of whether the resurrection happened. That is a question that historical methodology, by its own acknowledged limits, cannot answer definitively in either direction. Historians work with evidence, probability, and the known patterns of human behavior. The resurrection, if it occurred, was, by definition, an event outside the known patterns of human behavior, and therefore sits at the edge of what historical tools alone can resolve. The question that is harder to dismiss is simpler and more concrete. What happened to these people, the disciples of Jesus, The men and women who had followed him through Galilee, who had been present during his arrest, who by their own accounts had scattered and hidden when he was taken, were transformed within a remarkably short period into a community willing to make a specific, verifiable, publicly accountable claim in the most dangerous possible environment for making it. That transformation requires an explanation. People do not die for things they know to be fabricated. This is not a theological argument. It is a basic observation about human psychology and the instinct for self-preservation. Men and women will sometimes die for beliefs that are sincerely held, but factually mistaken. That happens throughout human history and proves only the capacity for sincere conviction. But the disciples were not in the position of people who had been told something by someone else and chose to believe it. They were in the position of people making first-person claims about things they said they had personally witnessed. Peter, who had denied knowing Jesus 3 times during the arrest, a detail so unflattering that its preservation in multiple gospel traditions is itself a mark of historical authenticity, since fabricated accounts tend not to preserve the failures of their heroes. This same Peter stood 40 days later before the Sanhedrin, the same council that had handed Jesus to Pilate, and refused to stop speaking about the resurrection when directly ordered to do so. James, the brother of Jesus, had not been a follower during the ministry. The Gospel of John notes explicitly that his brothers did not believe in him. This is another detail that fabricators would typically omit. Yet James became one of the central leaders of the Jerusalem community and, according to the first-century Jewish historian Josephus, a source entirely independent of Christian tradition, was executed around 62 CE for his faith. Paul of Tarsus had actively participated in the persecution of early followers of Jesus. His letters, which are among the earliest documents in the New Testament and are dated by scholars to within 20 years of the crucifixion, describe his own transformation as the result of an encounter with the risen Jesus, an encounter he clearly regarded as being of the same category as those reported by the original disciples. He catalogues, in his first letter to the Corinthians, a list of resurrection appearances that includes Peter, the 12, 500 people at one time, James, and finally himself. And he writes this within a period when many of those 500 witnesses were, as he notes, still alive and could be questioned. This is not the structure of legend. Legend develops over generations in the absence of living witnesses in communities removed from the original events. What Paul is doing in that passage is something closer to what a lawyer does, pointing to a body of living testimony and saying, "Go ask them." Rome did not know how to process any of this. The empire had a well-developed theology of power. Emperors were declared divine after death, and sometimes before it. The machinery of Roman religion was designed to absorb local deities and regional traditions, to fold them into the imperial framework, to make worship of the gods and loyalty to Rome essentially continuous with each other. This system had worked across the Mediterranean world with remarkable efficiency. It did not work here. The followers of Jesus refused, consistently and at enormous personal cost, to place Caesar within the framework of their worship. Not because they were politically revolutionary in the ordinary sense. Paul's letters explicitly instruct communities to respect governing authorities, to pay taxes, to live quietly, but because the claim at the center of their proclamation was not compatible with the claim at the center of Roman imperial theology. Caesar was Lord of the world. But if Jesus had risen from the dead, if the man Rome had crucified with the explicit title King of the Jews nailed above his head had in fact been vindicated by the God of Israel through resurrection, then the hierarchy of lordship had been permanently reordered in a way that no imperial decree could reverse. This is why the persecution came. Not because Christians were violent, not because they posed a military threat, but because their central confession, Jesus is Lord, was structurally incompatible with Caesar is Lord, and Rome understood, correctly, that you cannot have two ultimate authorities operating in the same social space without one eventually displacing the other. For 3 centuries, the empire tried. Nero blamed the Christians for the fire of Rome and executed them with a theatrical cruelty that even the Roman historian Tacitus, no friend of Christianity, described as excessive. Domitian demanded divine honors and moved against those who refused. Diocletian launched the most systematic persecution in the empire's history, burning scriptures, demolishing churches, executing clergy, attempting to administratively dismantle the movement from its institutional structure downward. None of it worked. The movement grew. In the prisons, in the catacombs, in the households of Roman soldiers and senators and slaves, across trade routes and family networks, and the slow, persistent, person-to-person transmission of a story that began with an empty tomb outside Jerusalem and refused, regardless of the cost of telling it, to stop being told. And underneath all of this, underneath the persecutions and the councils, and the centuries of theological development and the eventual stunning reversal when Constantine issued the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, and the empire that had crucified Jesus officially recognized the faith of his followers. Underneath all of it, the original question remained exactly where it had always been. The prophets had written. The words had been preserved. The events had occurred. The tomb had been found empty. The witnesses had spoken and continued speaking at the cost of everything Rome could take from them. What do you do with that? Not as an abstract theological exercise, as a human being standing in the actual world, looking at the actual evidence, aware of what it cost the people who carried this story forward through the first 3 centuries of its existence. The power of Rome, real power, iron and stone and the legal authority to end human life with complete impunity, looked directly at this story and could not stop it, could not contain it, could not discredit it sufficiently to make the witnesses go silent, could not produce the one piece of evidence that would have ended the movement permanently: a body. 2,000 years later, in languages Rome never spoke, in lands Rome never reached, in minds shaped by cultures Rome never imagined, the story is still being told. Not because an empire failed to suppress it. Empires fail to suppress things regularly, and most of those things fade with time regardless. But because something happened in Jerusalem, something that left a tomb empty and a group of frightened, scattered, ordinary people suddenly unafraid of the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever produced. That is where history reaches its limit, and where faith, grounded in the concrete reality of what actually occurred, begins.